Have you ever wondered what would happen if you truly committed to prayer every single day for 30 days? Not just in passing, not just before meals or when times get hard, but consistent, honest, intentional prayer? What would change in your life, in your heart, in your mind? This isn't a theory or a feel-good idea. It's a journey that many have taken, and the results are nothing short of transformational. I didn't expect anything miraculous. Honestly, I started out skeptical. I'd always believed in God, yes, but prayer felt like a routine, sometimes empty, sometimes forced. Life was so noisy, so fast, and in the middle of that, my moments with God had become more like quick messages than real conversations. But I decided to try anyway. 30 days of prayer. No skipping, no excuses. Just me, God, and a commitment to see what would happen if I actually talked to Him daily. By the end of the first week, something surprising began to shift. My thoughts were calmer. I didn't realize how much of my internal dialogue had been filled with anxiety and judgment until I started replacing it with prayer. I wasn't even praying for peace, I was just praying. Telling God about my day, my thoughts, my worries, the good stuff and the bad. And somehow, without asking for it directly, peace began to grow. There's a certain kind of silence you experience in prayer that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not just quiet, it's presence. And that presence changed how I processed everything. In the first few days, I was still distracted. My mind wandered. But I kept showing up. Every morning, I made space. I didn't need fancy words or eloquent phrases. I just needed to be there. And the more I showed up, the more real it felt. Prayer stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like a lifeline. Something sacred, something personal. I began to realize that prayer was less about changing God's mind and more about changing mine. My perspective began to shift. I stopped seeing prayer as a transaction and started seeing it as a relationship. By the middle of the second week, emotions I didn't expect started surfacing. Tears came during moments I thought were ordinary. I wasn't sad. I wasn't broken. I was just open. And in that openness, God was doing something inside of me. He was softening places I didn't know had grown hard. He was bringing light to areas I'd tried to keep hidden, even from myself. I didn't always hear answers, but I started sensing something deeper than words, a kind of divine understanding that went beyond my limited vocabulary. I didn't need to say much anymore. Just being still became enough. Listening became prayer. Breathing became prayer. Silence became sacred space. And then came the unexpected moments, the little miracles. Not fireworks or visions, but shifts. Forgiveness where there was bitterness. Clarity where there was confusion. Strength where there was exhaustion. These weren't things I had planned to pray for. They were the quiet gifts that came from simply spending time with God every single day. There were days I didn't feel like praying, days I was tired or busy or angry, but I did it anyway. Not out of guilt, but because something inside me had changed. Prayer was no longer an obligation. It was a desire, a craving. I didn't want to go a day without it, not because I feared God would punish me, but because I knew what life felt like with Him at the center, and I didn't want to go back. I noticed how my relationships began to shift. I was less reactive, more patient. The person who annoyed me at work, I started praying for them, not passively, but sincerely. And somehow, through those prayers, my own heart softened. I wasn't praying for God to change them. I was asking Him to change me. And He did. My faith, which had once felt stagnant, started to feel alive again. Like a river that had been dammed up for years, was finally flowing. Scripture made more sense. Worship became more heartfelt. I started seeing God's fingerprints in my everyday life, in conversations, in nature, in unexpected moments. The ordinary became sacred because I was learning to live with a prayerful awareness. Emotionally, I became more grounded. I didn't get swept up in fear or panic like before. It's not that life got easier. Circumstances didn't magically resolve. But I had something deeper anchoring me, a quiet trust forged through daily connection. I didn't need everything to make sense anymore. I just needed to know I wasn't alone. And prayer reminded me, day after day, that I wasn't. I also realized how much I had been talking at God instead of talking with Him. So I started making more room for silence. Just sitting, just listening. Not for answers, but for presence. That's when I began to feel the weight of how loved I truly was. Not because I performed, Not because I had it all together, but because God was with me, even in the quiet, even in the confusion, even in the days that didn't go as planned. Spiritually, I felt more connected than I had in years, not because I found some new method, but because I finally showed up every day. And in showing up, I rediscovered who I was and who God had always been. I used to think I needed a spiritual breakthrough, some dramatic experience, but what I needed was actually much simpler. I needed consistency, I needed presence, and I found it in 30 days of prayer. In those 30 days, God didn't just meet me, He walked with me, and I began to realize that He had always been walking with me. I just hadn't been paying attention. One of the most unexpected changes was in how I viewed time. I stopped rushing. Prayer reoriented my priorities. I stopped chasing after things that didn't matter and started valuing the quiet moments that did. A sunrise, a deep breath, a simple thank you. These became more than moments, they became prayers in themselves. Something else happened too. I became more honest with God and with myself. I stopped hiding behind polite prayers and started bringing Him the real stuff. The anger, the questions, the fears. And instead of rejection, I found grace. I found a God who wasn't afraid of my mess, a God who wanted all of me, not just the filtered parts. And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all. In praying every day, I discovered a kind of love I didn't know I needed. A love that saw me fully and stayed anyway. A love that didn't require perfection, just presence, just honesty. I can't promise that 30 days of prayer will fix your problems, but I can say this: it will change you. It will quiet the noise. It will soften your heart. It will bring light to the dark corners, and most of all, it will remind you that you are not alone. Ever. If you've ever felt distant from God, if you've ever wondered if prayer really matters, try this. Just 30 days. Every day. Show up. Talk to Him. Listen. Be still. Be real. Watch what happens when you invite the Creator of the universe into your everyday, one prayer at a time. Week 2 started with a sense of familiarity. Prayer no longer felt foreign, it was becoming part of my rhythm. But something deeper began to happen that I didn't expect. I started noticing how much I had filtered myself in the past, even in prayer. I would only bring God the pieces I thought were safe. But this time, I decided to be brutally honest. I told Him everything, my doubts, my envy, my weariness. And instead of feeling shame, I felt release. There's a freedom in knowing you don't have to perform in God's presence. He already knows, and He still welcomes you. That honesty began to affect my self-awareness. I started recognizing unhealthy patterns in my thoughts and habits. Before, I would brush them off or justify them. Now I was confronting them in prayer. And it wasn't condemning, it was healing. God wasn't pointing a finger, He was opening a door. I felt invited to grow, not pressured to fix myself overnight. His grace gave me space to change slowly, intentionally. Around day 10, something strange happened. I woke up already praying. Not out loud, not in words, but in my thoughts. It was like my spirit had been trained to reach out to God even before my mind fully awakened. It wasn't forced, it was natural. And that moment made me realize prayer wasn't just something I did anymore. It was becoming part of who I was. I also started noticing the little ways God was showing up. A friend texting me just when I needed encouragement. A scripture verse popping up on my feed that spoke directly to something I had prayed the night before. Even the timing of random events started to feel like more than coincidence. Was it God moving? Or was I just more in tune with His presence? Maybe both. But I no longer felt like I was walking alone. At work, things didn't suddenly get easier, but I handled them differently. When stress hit, I prayed instead of spiraling. When I felt overlooked, I remembered I was seen by God. That awareness anchored me. I wasn't reactive anymore. I was reflective. Prayer gave me a place to process my emotions before they turned into actions I'd regret. One morning, I found myself praying for people I had never prayed for before. Politicians. People who had hurt me. Strangers. I didn't do it because I was told to. I did it because my heart was being softened. Prayer wasn't just about me anymore. It was becoming a bridge between me and the world around me. And through that bridge, I started to feel more connected, less isolated. The second week also brought a deeper hunger for Scripture. I wasn't reading out of obligation. I wanted to know more about the God I was talking to. The verses came alive. They weren't just ancient words, they were present truths. Some days, I'd read a single sentence and sit with it for minutes, letting it sink in, letting it shape how I saw the day ahead. Emotionally, things got a little messier before they got clearer. Prayer has a way of stirring up what you've buried. I had moments of unexpected grief, memories I hadn't revisited in years, but instead of shutting them down, I brought them into the light. And God didn't scold me, He comforted me. His presence didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. Even my past began to look different through the lens of grace. There was a morning where I sat in silence for almost 30 minutes, just breathing, just being, and I didn't feel the need to say anything. That day, I realized prayer wasn't about filling time with words. It was about making space for God to fill me. In that silence, I felt held, and that feeling carried me through a chaotic afternoon where everything seemed to go wrong, but somehow I didn't fall apart. I began writing my prayers some days, journaling what I was feeling and what I sensed God was whispering back. The pages started to tell a story of growth, not linear, not perfect, but honest and beautiful. There were days where I felt distant, distracted, even doubtful. But those prayers mattered too. I didn't need to impress God. I just needed to be with Him. I also noticed how much easier it became to say no to certain temptations. Not because I was trying harder, but because I was more filled. When your soul is full of God's presence, the noise of the world loses its grip. The things that used to lure me in started to lose their shine. And it wasn't because I had grown stronger, it was because I had grown closer. There's a confidence that comes when you walk closely with God. Not arrogance, humble confidence. You begin to remember who you are, because you remember whose you are. I stopped chasing validation from others. I stopped measuring my worth by achievements. Prayer reminded me that I was already loved, already known, already chosen. Some nights I didn't have energy to say much. So I'd whisper, God, I'm tired, but I'm here. And that was enough. That was all He needed. My presence, not my performance. And every time I showed up, He met me. Not always with answers, but always with peace. By day 14, prayer had become a habit, but more than that, it had become a hunger. I didn't want to miss it. Not because I feared punishment, but because I knew what it felt like to walk through a day without that divine connection, and I didn't want to go back. Life without daily prayer felt shallow now, like living in black and white after seeing in color. I began praying out loud more, especially in the car, talking to God like He was right there in the passenger seat, and somehow that made Him feel even closer. My prayers weren't structured or poetic. They were raw, personal, human, and that's exactly how He wanted them. I also started interceding more, for friends, for family, for the world. Prayer expanded my empathy. When you start praying for people, you start loving them in deeper ways. You see their humanity, you see their pain, and God begins to share His heart with you. Those 2 weeks didn't turn me into a perfect Christian. I still wrestled, I still fell short, but I stopped hiding. Prayer taught me to stop pretending, and in that honesty I found a strength I didn't know I had. Not my strength, His strength made perfect in my weakness. Every day I kept going, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. Prayer was rewiring my heart. It was changing how I saw God, how I saw myself, how I saw others, and little by little, it was changing my life. Week 3 brought something I didn't expect. Resistance, not from outside, but from within. I'd wake up and feel a strange heaviness, a quiet voice saying, "Does this really matter?" The initial excitement had faded, and now I was facing the wall every habit builder knows, the middle. The part where the new rhythm still feels unfamiliar, and the old one keeps calling you back. But I had come too far to turn around. I didn't try to fight the resistance. I brought it into prayer. God, I don't feel like talking today, but I'm here. And somehow those simple prayers felt the most honest and the most powerful. This 3rd week wasn't about emotional highs. It was about faithfulness, showing up when I didn't feel anything, praying when I had no words, listening when the silence felt awkward. And in that space, God began to deepen something in me. It wasn't fireworks, it was foundation. And I realized sometimes silence is God working beneath the surface. He's not always loud. Sometimes He whispers in stillness, but He's always present. I also began to pray differently. Less fix this, change that, and more your will, not mine. Less control, more surrender. That shift changed how I approached problems. Instead of demanding solutions, I started asking for wisdom. I didn't want escape anymore, I wanted endurance, and prayer became the training ground for that endurance. It wasn't just a lifeline, it was a lifestyle. During one evening walk, I whispered a prayer without thinking, "Teach me to love better." I didn't even know what I meant fully, but it came from somewhere deep. The next day I got a text from someone I hadn't talked to in years, an apology. And suddenly that prayer felt less like something I had said and more like something God had planted. Prayer had become a two-way street. I was speaking, but I was also being shaped. By the middle of the third week, I had developed a strange peace even in stressful moments. I wasn't reacting with fear or anxiety like I used to. It wasn't that the situations had changed, it was that I had. Prayer had strengthened my inner world, so the outer chaos didn't have the same power over me. I didn't feel immune, but I felt anchored. There was a moment during a lunch break where I sat quietly under a tree and didn't say a word. I just breathed. I felt God's presence in the wind, in the shade, in the moment. Prayer was no longer only about speaking, it was about awareness. Being aware that I am not alone, that even when I'm quiet, I am heard, that even when I'm still, I am held. One night I journaled. Prayer is not about changing God, it's about letting Him change me. And I saw that play out in how I responded to my own weaknesses. Before, I'd be harsh with myself, critical, impatient. But now I started showing myself the same grace I felt in prayer. It was like God's kindness was rubbing off on me. I wasn't perfect, but I was more at peace with the process. In conversations, I became more present, less quick to speak, more open to listen. I caught myself praying silently while others talked, not in a super spiritual way, but in a way that helped me stay grounded. God helped me really hear them, helped me love them well. Those small invisible prayers shaped how I showed up for others, and people noticed. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in how calm I was, how I responded with compassion, how I wasn't easily rattled anymore. I began waking up with a different kind of purpose, not just to get things done, but to be someone intentional, someone connected. Prayer gave me a sense of identity that wasn't rooted in productivity, performance, or approval. It reminded me that I'm already enough because I belong to someone greater. One morning, as I poured coffee, I whispered, "Thank you for today." That was it, but it felt like a sacred moment. Prayer had crept into the ordinary, into my steps, my chores, my thoughts. It was no longer just a scheduled time, it was a continual awareness. And that awareness brought peace. I didn't have to conjure God, He was already here. I just had to tune in. I also began praying more for the future, not out of anxiety, but out of trust. God, shape what's ahead. Prepare me for what I can't see. Help me be faithful in what's right in front of me. It wasn't a grasping prayer. It was an open-handed one. And that posture of surrender gave me clarity. I stopped rushing so much. I started seeing today as enough. There was one afternoon where I felt overwhelmed. Deadlines, conversations, inner noise. I stepped away for just 5 minutes, sat in the stairwell, closed my eyes. God, I can't carry this all. And in that moment it felt like He whispered, "You're not meant to." The pressure lifted. Not the responsibilities, but the lie that I had to bear them alone. That's what prayer kept reminding me. I am not alone. Not in joy, not in sorrow, not in fear, not in fatigue. And slowly, I found myself praying without even realizing it. During a drive, while folding laundry, waiting in line. It was like my heart had developed a new language, one that reached for God in the in-between spaces. Prayer became a heartbeat, steady, quiet, life-giving. On day 20, I noticed a quiet joy. It wasn't loud, it wasn't tied to circumstances, it was just there, like sunlight through clouds. I couldn't explain it, but I knew where it came from. Time with God had changed the texture of my soul. I didn't need everything to go my way to feel okay anymore. I just needed to stay connected. That day I walked by someone crying outside a cafe. Normally I would have hesitated, but instead I stopped, asked if they were okay, said a quiet prayer for them. That moment didn't solve their problem, but it reminded me, prayer moves us toward love. It doesn't just comfort us, it compels us to act. It opens our eyes to others. By the end of week 3, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't chasing spiritual highs, I was simply abiding. And in that abiding, I felt more alive, more rooted, more aware. Prayer had become like breathing, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, sometimes labored, but always essential. Week 4 began with a moment of clarity. This wasn't a challenge anymore, it was a relationship. What had started as a commitment to pray daily had now become a way of life. I didn't have to remind myself to pray, it just flowed. And the deeper I went, the more I realized that prayer wasn't changing my life in a loud, dramatic way. It was reshaping me quietly from the inside out. I remember standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, when a deep gratitude rose in me. Not for anything specific, just for life, for breath, for the simple gift of being alive. I whispered thank you and kept stirring. It struck me, prayer had woven itself into the fabric of my normal moments. It wasn't just a spiritual activity, it was the undercurrent of my day. I didn't need to retreat to a mountaintop. God was here in the ordinary. That week, I noticed how differently I was responding to stress. I wasn't panicking, I was pausing. I wasn't reacting in anger. I was asking God for patience in real time. And that made all the difference. It wasn't that problems disappeared, it's that I wasn't carrying them alone. I had a rhythm now. When anxiety rose, I didn't spiral, I prayed. When discouragement crept in, I didn't shut down. I opened my heart. One morning I journaled, "Prayer is the soil where peace grows." And I meant it. The more I prayed, the less I needed to control everything. I began to trust more, not because life was easier, but because I had someone walking with me through it all. I stopped praying just for answers. I started praying for presence, and God met me there. Midway through week 4, I looked back and realized how far I'd come. Not in terms of productivity or goals, but in heart. I was less easily offended, more compassionate, slower to speak. And the most surprising part? I wasn't striving, I wasn't faking. It was natural, it was fruit. I understood, maybe for the first time, what Jesus meant when he said to abide in me. This was what abiding looked like, connection, moment by moment, rooted in love. There was one afternoon I walked through the park, earbuds out, phone silent, just listening to the breeze. I felt so small and so safe. That's what prayer had taught me. Being small isn't scary when you're in the hands of a big God. I didn't have to have all the answers. I just needed to stay near to the one who did. A friend called me that evening, overwhelmed with life. Instead of jumping into advice mode, I asked, "Can I pray with you?" We did, right over the phone. And afterward they said, "I didn't even know I needed that." I smiled. Because that's exactly how I had felt so many times during these 30 days. Prayer had opened a door to peace I didn't even know I needed. I also began to notice how prayer was healing parts of me I hadn't looked at in a while. Old regrets, hidden insecurities, fears I didn't have words for. As I brought those into the light, God didn't meet me with shame. He met me with grace, over and over. Prayer had become less of a monologue and more of a sacred exchange. My brokenness for his healing, my questions for his wisdom, my weariness for his rest. On day 28, I had an overwhelming sense of joy, not tied to any success, not even tied to spiritual achievement. It was simply the joy of knowing I was loved, known, and safe. The kind of joy that doesn't scream, it settles in quietly. The kind that says, even in the middle of all this, you're okay. Prayer had taught me that God isn't looking for perfect words. He's looking for an honest heart. And I had learned how to bring mine over and over again. The final days of this 30-day journey didn't feel like an end. They felt like a beginning. I couldn't imagine going back to life without this rhythm, without this connection. I didn't need fireworks or signs. I just needed space to be with God. And I had found it, right here in the middle of real life, in the quiet moments, in the daily steps, in the sacred space of prayer. And the most powerful realization of all, it wasn't just that I had prayed every day for 30 days. It's that God had met me every day. Whether I came with joy or pain, energy or exhaustion, words or silence, he was there, consistent, kind, faithful. Prayer hadn't made life perfect, but it had made life anchored. That anchor carried me through the waves of doubt and distraction, through the highs of connection and the lows of routine. It reminded me that I don't need to climb a ladder to reach God. He's already here, reaching for me. And all I need to do is turn my heart toward him. That's what prayer is, turning again and again, returning again and again, remaining through it all. So here I was, 30 days in, changed. Not in a way the world would necessarily notice, but in a way that heaven surely did. My heart was softer, my thoughts clearer, my steps lighter, and my soul anchored in something eternal. Prayer didn't just become a habit, it became a home. There's something sacred about the quiet transformation that prayer brings, not the kind that shows up in status updates or visible achievements, but the kind that reshapes your soul in stillness. As I entered the 5th stage of this journey, I realized that prayer had started to reorder my desires. I wasn't chasing the same things anymore. What I craved now was presence, God's presence. What I hungered for was depth, not distraction. One of the most surprising effects of praying daily for this long was how it sharpened my awareness. I became more present. I noticed the light filtering through the blinds in the morning, the way the wind moved the trees, the subtle emotions in other people's voices. It was as if my soul had been dusted off. Prayer had peeled away layers of noise and numbness, and in their place, clarity grew. This week, my faith didn't just feel personal, it felt anchored. I wasn't depending on feelings anymore. I wasn't waiting to feel close to God in order to pray. I prayed because I trusted He was there. I prayed because even in silence, He was listening. And the more I showed up in that space, the more I realized that God had never stopped showing up for me. On day 31, I didn't stop. I just kept going. Something in me knew this wasn't a finish line. It was a doorway. A new way of being had begun. I saw how prayer had touched every part of me, my reactions, my words, my inner dialogue. I was more honest now, not just with God, but with myself. Prayer had become like breathing, not forced, but necessary. Not mechanical, but life-giving. I started noticing how prayer had changed my relationships. I was more patient. I was slower to judge. I listened more deeply. I found myself praying for others in the middle of conversations, not always out loud but silently, carrying their burdens to God in real time. That kind of love doesn't come from human willpower. It flows from connection with God. One evening I was reading a passage in Philippians. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer, present your requests to God. And it hit me. This wasn't a rule. It was an invitation. A way to live free. A way to move through life unburdened. Prayer was the bridge between what I couldn't control and the God who holds all things. The anxiety I used to live with? It hadn't vanished, but it had lost its grip. Fear still whispered, but now I had allowed a voice within, the voice of truth, cultivated through weeks of prayer. That voice reminded me, you're not alone. You're not forgotten. You're not failing. You're held. That's what prayer gave me, a place to bring the lies and exchange them for truth. I thought about the version of me who started this journey, hesitant, uncertain, wondering if this would even matter. And I wanted to go back and whisper, keep going. You have no idea how close God really is. Because that was the ultimate gift of this 30-day prayer journey. Not answered requests or dramatic revelations, but nearness, an abiding peace that rested deeper than words. Each day of prayer had built something invisible yet unshakable. A structure within my soul, a foundation that no storm could wash away. It wasn't religious duty, it was relationship, it was trust, it was grace upon grace, and that became my new normal. I also began to embrace silence more. I wasn't rushing to fill the space with words, I was learning to wait, to listen, to rest in the stillness, knowing that God often speaks without sound. That's something prayer teaches you when you stick with it. Not everything holy is loud. Some of the deepest healing happens quietly, like roots growing underground. The emotional impact surprised me too. I had more capacity for joy, more room for grief. I wasn't numbing anymore. I was living, fully, intentionally, prayerfully. That's what happens when you make space for God every day. You stop pushing life away and you start welcoming it with open hands. If I had to name one transformation that mattered most, it would be this. I became more aware of love. God's love for me, my love for others, the power of love to change a moment, a mindset, a life. Daily prayer revealed just how much love was waiting to be noticed, received, and given away. And even though there were days I didn't know what to say, I kept showing up. Because I learned that prayer is not about having the right words, it's about presence. God isn't grading our eloquence, He's welcoming our hearts. And my heart, week by week, was becoming more at ease in His presence. Somewhere along the way, prayer stopped being a practice and became a place. A place I could go when I was weary or joyful or confused. A place where I could bring my whole self and never be turned away. That place is always open, always sacred, always home. That's the miracle of praying every day for 30 days. It doesn't just change your schedule, it changes your soul. And once your soul tastes that kind of nearness to God, you'll never want to live without it again. By day 30, the act of praying every day had not only become second nature, it had become essential. What started as a discipline had grown into a quiet delight. Prayer wasn't on my to-do list anymore. It had seeped into the very rhythm of my life. I found myself talking to God in the ordinary, while washing dishes, walking down the street, pausing before a conversation. It wasn't just a morning or evening activity, it was constant communion, like breath. The most profound change, however, wasn't just in behavior, it was in identity. I no longer felt like someone trying to connect with God. I felt like someone living, connected. And that shift transformed the way I saw myself, not as someone striving to earn closeness with God, but someone already deeply loved, invited, and welcomed. That assurance brought peace, unlike anything else. This final stretch of the 30-day journey showed me that prayer doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. In fact, it's often in the subtle, consistent returning to God that the deepest work is done. My mind, once cluttered and chaotic, had grown clearer. My emotions, once reactive, had become gentler. I wasn't perfect, but I was being reshaped. I also noticed something unexpected. I had more courage. Prayer gave me strength to face things I used to avoid. Conversations, decisions, risks. Not because I suddenly had all the answers, but because I trusted the one who did. I didn't need to control every outcome. I just needed to stay close to the one who walks with me through it all. And that closeness had awakened something creative in me. Words flowed more freely. Ideas came with ease. I was more present in conversations, more attuned to beauty. I saw God in places I'd never thought to look, in art, in silence, in the face of a stranger. Prayer had expanded my vision, not just vertically toward heaven, but outward into the world around me. Emotionally, I felt steadier, less tossed around by the day's events. Even when things didn't go my way, I noticed I bounced back faster. It wasn't that life got easier. It was that I had a place to return to every time I felt overwhelmed, a quiet center in God that never shifted. That's what daily prayer builds, an inner life strong enough to hold steady when outer life gets chaotic. Perhaps the greatest gift of praying daily for 30 days was this: I no longer feared silence. I used to avoid it, filling it with music, noise, distractions, but now silence felt full, alive. Because in that stillness I had learned to hear the voice of love, the gentle, unwavering presence of God reminding me, "You are not alone, I am here." And I believe that's what this journey is truly about, not becoming more spiritual for the sake of performance, but becoming more human by walking daily with the divine. When you pray every day, you start living differently. You forgive more freely, you listen more deeply, you dream more boldly. Because prayer doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes you. So if you've ever wondered whether it's worth it to pray every day, to carve out time, to sit in silence, to speak even when no one else is around, let me tell you, it is. It's worth every moment. Because every prayer, even the clumsy ones, even the silent ones, brings you closer to the God who loves you more than you can imagine. And here's the secret. The transformation doesn't stop at day 30. It keeps unfolding. Every day with God opens new layers of healing, new depths of understanding, new invitations to love. Prayer is not a finish line, it's a beginning. One you can step into right now, wherever you are, however you feel. Just start, and then keep going. Because 1 month of prayer can shape your soul for a lifetime. If something in this journey has awakened your heart, if you're longing for true peace, deeper clarity, and a closer walk with God, don't stop here. Subscribe to Holy Path Insights and continue with us as we seek the life God is calling us to. There is more ahead, more grace, more healing, more hope. Stay near, stay faithful, and keep walking the Holy Path.